Okay. Hi, hello, how are you? It's Tuesday, April 13th, and I just squeaked in a workout, so I'm a little sweaty. Sorry. I wanted to get one in and I got back a little bit later than I thought. And before I dive into dairy, I just want to talk a moment about a workout because it's present for me right now. So, in my 20s, 30 years ago, I would have spent an hour and a half at the gym. I would have felt a need to do this whole regimen and I would have had it all worked out and cardio and weights and all of that. And as a 56-year-old woman now, what I realize is number one, for my hormone balance and for my weight and for my energy, I absolutely need to do exercise every day and I absolutely need to include weight training. So, especially if you're a woman post menopause, but I don't have to do an hour at the gym anymore. So I literally, it's 1:30 right now, my time. I literally went over there at 10 of 1. I did 10 minutes of intervals, on an equipment to get my heart rate up. And then I just did one muscle group, like 4 exercises, and I'm back. I don't look my best for the live, but I got it in. And anyway, that wasn't the point of the live, but I just wanted to share that with you because if you're not including, especially some sort of weight training, that really helps keep your testosterone levels up. And again, as a postmenopausal woman, that really helps with hormones. So, just side note. But today's conversation is about dairy because yesterday I talked about gluten and the gut and glyphosate in particular, and how a lot of us have now damage to the lining of our gut for various reasons. There's lots of reasons why that happens, but we focused on that yesterday. So today I wanted to talk about dairy because it's another thing that the people that I work with have to cut out. And it's such a bummer, right? I mean, like pizza has them both. So there you go. But it can be such a bummer to be like, I can't have dairy, I can't have gluten. And so I thought, let's talk about dairy a bit. And I would share before I get started that a lot of times when I work with people, this is the place where we start, but months down the road, it's quite possible, dairy more than gluten, I would say, that you can add some back in. Some forms might be better than others, etc. So that's a little bit of more of an extended conversation, but I'm hoping it brings good news. So, dairy, first of all, what I want to say is a lot of our recommendations that we have, and I've got some notes here so I don't forget what I want to say, but the recommendations that we have 100 years ago, things were put in place to make sure we were getting minimal amounts and minimal amounts of calcium. So at that time, milk and milk in particular, but dairy products were seen as the best source of calcium, and the concern was that people weren't going to get enough of it. Now, 100 years later, it's not a matter of are we not getting enough. It's a matter of we're an obese society. We have more than enough food. We don't have enough nutrients, but what we do understand now is that dairy is not the best source of calcium. So, green leafy vegetables, much better option, number one. Number two, making sure that you have a balance with vitamin K so that your calcium is going into your bones. So if you're drinking milk or eating dairy as a source of calcium for your bones, it's probably not the best idea to use that as your main source and to make sure you have a cofactor, then vitamin K, to get that into your bones. Now let's look at politics a little bit and government RDA because the USDA and the government, the Department of Agriculture, made the food pyramid back like when I was in school in the 1960s and 70s. The food pyramid was made to actually help support the industry in selling their products. That really was the behind the scenes motive. So it was the Department of Agriculture worked with the US, they created this USDA and these recommendations to make sure that we were selling, or they were selling, sorry, products that were the biggest industry in this country. And so we're still using those recommendations to go by. Now, the food pyramid has changed a bit, I think. Now you see, it used to be a pyramid. Now you see like a pie plate and it shows you different sections of your plate. But we are still being told, in fact, school lunches are still requiring milk to be part of a school lunch. And what's so interesting is it cannot be plain unflavored milk. It has to be sugar sweetened milk as part of the school lunch supply if you're buying, like in a public school, if you're buying your lunch. So I just think that's so interesting that it has to include milk, number one, and number two, it's going to be with increased sugar content. So it's just the big picture to keep in mind as we're looking at dairy. So now let's talk about dairy and actually what it does or doesn't do for our health. So let me see what I have here. So the biggest thing, and this is for across the board, the whole population, not people with chronic health issues, okay? Because that gets into the next part of what I'm going to talk about. But across the board, dairy has an elevated IGF, which is insulin growth factor. So when you think about the animals that produce milk for their young that we typically are going to get milk from, in this country it would be cows or goats or maybe sheep. In other continents like Africa and Asia, it might be other like grazing animals, the animals that graze out on the plains, but their babies are susceptible to predators. So those babies need to grow fast so that they can be big and strong and fast as quick as possible so that their species survives. So there are 24 natural occurring hormones in milk. Forget about what we add in this country, just naturally occurring, that get those baby animals to be as big as possible, as fast as possible. And what does that mean for us as human beings? That means we are also getting these growth hormones that, as certainly as we age and get into adulthood, what is it stimulating growing? It's stimulating cancer cells to grow. Those are hormones that are stimulating cell growth. And what kinds of cells is concerning, because that IGF does promote, there is a definite link to certain kinds of prostate cancer and to certain kinds of endometrial cancers, specifically because of those hormones. So that's number one to think about. And then you think about years ago, 100 years ago, when cows were being farmed in different ways than the way that they are now. A cow would get pregnant and have a calf, and the milk was not harvested for people until after that happened. So we didn't take the milk from a cow when she was pregnant or when she was nursing. When you put recommendations or guidelines, government guidelines in place, 3 servings a day, milk does a body good, and generations of people are raised on drinking milk, you have to keep up with that demand, right? Which was why they put it in place, to make sure there was a demand to serve our agriculture. So now there's a demand of many, many people making sure their kids get milk, and that cheese is a great source of protein and that's a good snack. And so now we have to keep cows producing milk much higher than what they needed to do 100 years ago. So we're actually milking them right through their pregnancies, which means elevated estrogen, elevated progesterone, all of the hormones that would go up. We are now drinking in our milk and in our dairy sources. So that's happening. And we're milking them not only right through their pregnancy, but right through them nursing their calves, which did not used to be done. And then what are we feeding them? So there's the whole milk, grass-fed versus grain-fed. And typically people love, in terms of the steak and the meat, they love the corn-fed meat better because of the taste. It's just what they're used to. I happen to love grass-fed now because it's all that I eat, if I can help it. So if a cow is raised on a farm in a way that she's being milked all throughout her pregnancy, she's probably, I'm sure, I would bet my house on it, locked in a cage, not eating as she's meant to, and being fed the wheat and the corn that many of us know. And if you just look at the conversation yesterday about gluten, we're now going to be getting in those gluten proteins through her feed and through drinking the milk. So now we're getting into the part where people with chronic health conditions are going to start to see more of a problem. So I wanted to point out the the IGF, the growth factor, and the general population, because I would think anybody would want to take a look at that and say, do I want to really put that to that degree in my body as often as I've maybe thought was okay, and be promoting cells to grow when I'm no longer a baby that's trying to grow. So that's that. But now, if we talk about the chronic health issues, if you remember, if you didn't see yesterday's conversation, I talked about gluten and that it's a protein, and there's different smaller proteins like glutenin and gliadin that make up gluten, and how those have become a problem for our body and that they leak into the bloodstream. So, what's so interesting, and I'll share it in just a second, but what's interesting about dairy, so dairy has several proteins just like wheat does. So there's gluten, gliadin, glutenin, and then there's a whole lot of other non-gluten wheat proteins. Dairy has casein, and then it has several others. And I'm going to pull up a report so that you can see a little bit about that. But what is so interesting is that casein, A1 casein, which is the main protein in dairy here in this country, because of how our cows are being raised and farmed, that's the protein that's being produced. If you could get an heirloom cow, meaning a cow that genetically through its line has been allowed to graze and eat grass and not been raised in the conventional way, then you would have access to A2 casein. And in Europe, that is more often the case. But here, it's difficult to find A2 casein, and it's very expensive if you were going to look for A2 casein milk. And I just want to remind you, casein is only one of the proteins. So there's multiple other ones when we look at the report. But the A1 casein matches up very similarly to gluten in its molecular makeup, the structure that it looks like when you line up the peptides and you make the protein chain. They actually resemble each other very much, as does corn. So everybody's different, but when an immune system has been triggered because of proteins entering into the bloodstream due to damage at the gut wall, which has now caused gaps and proteins are leaking in, and now the immune system tags that protein, that's a problem. Whenever I see you, I'm going to go after you. And now casein looks very much like gluten. So now the immune system says, oh, there you are again. I'm going to go after you. So now casein has become an inflammatory immune triggering protein for people with chronic health conditions, for people with better gut health and immune systems that haven't been thrown off in the way that mine has been or was. Now it's better, but it had been. You may not see a reaction, but for most people, these are the things that are related to dairy and having a reaction. Adult acne, any kind of skin issues can have a dairy component to it, and definitely a gut component. But adult acne, psoriasis, eczema, any of the GI systems that you might complain of, diarrhea, gas, bloating, constipation. If you've been diagnosed with irritable bowel, irritable bowel is an umbrella term for you've got a lot of symptoms, so we're going to call it this syndrome. But it's really a dysbiosis in the gut and a gut lining that's been damaged, and probably an abundance of not the best bacteria and probably not enough of the good bacteria. But that would be irritable bowel. But all of those things can be triggered by a response to dairy. And so that's important because in the people with chronic health issues, dairy is one of the things that we eliminate out, and we look to see what gets better. And as it gets better, and as we work on the gut, we add it back and look to see, are you better now? Everybody's different, right? So you can't make a blanket statement about anyone, to my mind anyway. The other thing that I want to point out that is different between grass-fed and grain-fed is that the ratio of omega-6 fatty acids to omega-3 fatty acids is better in grass-fed. So it's a 1-to-1 ratio. If you're paying attention to your fatty acids, and bringing down inflammation. Omega-3 fatty acids are very important to help combat oxidative stress and to bring down inflammation in your body. And most of our oils that we're using in this country, all the oils, I remember when I was like young and newly married and I was switching to canola oil and vegetable oil. And like when I was a kid, we actually had lard in the house, right? So I was like, oh my gosh, I don't use lard to cook. I would use these vegetable oils. And those vegetable oils are actually the problem. They're highly inflammatory because they have such a skewed ratio of omega 6s, too much omega 6s to the omega 3s. And then there's also omega 9s, which is, less of the three of them. That's the smallest amount. But we look at really the balance between the 3 and the 6. So the grass fed dairy has a good 1-to-1 ratio. So that's really important. I also wanted to point out, and then I will pull up this report, but the last thing I want to point out before I do that is the difference between processed dairy and raw dairy, because you could still, if you can find it, it's not easy, but if you can find it, you can probably do better if you have raw dairy. So what does that mean? Well, we've got a few things that happen to milk when we produce it. We pasteurize it. So pasteurizing milk is heated to kill the bacteria. And of course, that's important if you're gathering milk and shipping it out, and it's going to be quite a bit of time until people get the product. If you could get your milk and your cheese from a local like guy that's 10 minutes down the road from you, you wouldn't have to have it pasteurized. When I was a kid, we went to my cousin's house, and right across the street was a farmer, and we used to walk across the street. We used to go early in the morning. I mean, when I was like 6, and we would go across, and we could bring a bucket, and we could get our milk and then go back, and that would be the milk for the next day or two. But that's what pasteurization does. But when you heat it to kill the bacteria, you are changing the proteins. So again, we have that change in proteins compared to how our body recognized, just like the GMO wheat, it's a different protein than historically, 200 years ago, 500 years ago when we were drinking milk. The next thing that we do is homogenization. And homogenization is also changing the proteins. It's passing an electric current through the milk. And the purpose of that is to break up the fat globules. So if anybody's old enough to remember getting, like, the milkman would deliver milk on your porch. We had that when I was a kid. I'm really feeling old all of a sudden. But I remember when I was little, we got a milk delivery, and there would be the fat on top of the milk, and then or the cream or whatever would be thicker, and it would rise to the top. So homogenization takes an electric current and passes it through to break up the fat, so that the fat globules are more distributed throughout the product. So it doesn't stay on the top. Those fat globules contribute to people develop those. They act as antigens in the body, so that triggers the immune system. If it was done the old fashioned way, like when I was little, and you would get your bucket, you would scoop off the fat, right? And people did whatever they did with it. I think sometimes they used it to feed other animals or whatever, and then you just drank the milk. But now those fat globules are distributed through, and they become antigens that trigger people's immune systems to now have antibodies. So now we have another reason why people with compromised immune systems, meaning they have a propensity for autoimmunity, they have not great gut health, and now they have these fat globules due to the homogenization process triggering an immune response. So that's the difference with processed dairy and raw dairy. If you can get raw dairy, and you can get that, it can be pasteurized but not homogenized. You can find that in some places anyway. I can find it. It's a little bit of a drive for me, and I don't go regularly, but I do know a place that has it. It's probably a 35-minute ride for me. So if you can find that, that's what raw dairy is. It has not been homogenized. It doesn't have those fat globules throughout the whole thing, and it's not as triggering for the immune system. So that could be an option. Okay, then the other thing, oops, my computer's almost fell. is to think when we look at animals that have been allowed to eat a variety, so they're grazing in a pasture that has a lot of different kinds of grass, or there's other plants, the goats and the sheep, they'll eat the bottom leaves of, plants that are there. They don't only just eat the grass. And when we look at the milk from those animals compared to the animals that are being fed the grains, the wheat and the corn, the catechins, which are what's in green tea that makes green tea so good for you, those are catechins. Those are anti-inflammatory, they help with oxidative stress. The catechins in animals who are allowed to eat a variety from multiple different plants, that variety changes their milk and makes it much healthier for us to consume. So that would be the last thing that I want to just point out. So let me share my screen. Hold on. Okay. Okay, so here is a Zoomer's test. So Food Zoomers is the test that I use because it looks at the protein level. It will look at certain foods. So this is the part of the test that looks at casein. See casein here, and it's going to compare AS1 casein and AS2. So, this person, it's not a problem. This is actually my test. So let me not say this person. I just pulled up my test. I don't have a problem with dairy. But what I want you to see is, like, for instance, this AS2. So it is the AS2 casein, which I talked about being a better option. However, the antigens in this type of protein overlap with antigens that contribute to uveitis, which is inflammation in the middle layer of the eye. So people with autoimmune disease, that's not an uncommon issue to have inflammation in the eyes. And so you can see that the proteins in the AS2 protein and in the antigen that causes that in the eyes overlap. And so I'm grateful to say it's not a problem for me, but you just want to look. Now we look at beta casein. This one here says, I don't know if you can read it. It says islets of Langerhans. Those are particular cells in the pancreas. And the pancreas, what does the pancreas do? It produces insulin to help you manage your blood sugar. So when you have sugar in your blood, the body recognizes that because it's not a good thing to have elevated blood sugar. The pancreas produces insulin, which goes into the bloodstream and says, let me clear you out. And it will pull the sugar into the cells for storage or for energy. If you're going for a run, you'll burn it. If you're sitting, it'll go into storage. So dairy, this particular protein, could affect people if they have this propensity with how their pancreas is managing their blood sugar. And it says here, this is from the lab, it's been demonstrated that consumption of milk containing A1 beta casein was associated with greater GI symptoms, transit time, softer stools, diarrhea, etc. And then also can affect attributed to the presence of where was it? Oh, up here. Sorry. I should put my glasses on so I could read. Can cross-react with leading to a type 1 diabetes. So type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune. Type 2 diabetes is lifestyle. Type 1 diabetes is autoimmune. And this particular protein says right here that it can cross-react and contribute to type 1 diabetes. This here is the last one that we'll look at, but I just wanted you to get an idea of how important it is to know how you're responding to all the different proteins. So this is a whole nother protein, beta casomorphine. And when we see morphine, to me, that's like, oh, morphine, right? That reminds me of morphine because it is. It's these peptides have opioid properties, okay? And they're formed from a proteolytic digestion of beta casein. So let me just scoot down here. An association with this particular protein with schizophrenia and autism. So it's been linked to symptoms of autism and schizophrenia in both animal and human trials. And also this particular protein is found a lot in the urine of autistic people. So they're linking to these different mood and personality issues. And then the other thing that's good to notice is, and I'm going to stop sharing now and come back to you guys. What's good to notice is that sometimes you will feel like you're in withdrawal when you start to cut these foods out. I didn't talk about it yesterday, but um, some of the proteins in wheat have that same effect. So you get withdrawal type of reactions. You might feel achy, you might feel moody, you might not sleep well, it might affect your digestion until you get through it. So I'm just pointing it out because it's good to notice and that you can then manage that. So, yeah. So Suzanne is saying that you've tried, let's see, you tried the A2 milk, but it didn't work for you. Cook's Venture Meat and grass-fed, grass-finished is good but pricey, unfortunately. But listen, dollars talk. So the more people who say, "Hold on, I want to have the things that are going to keep me feeling well, and I'm going to purchase that," it's the prices will come down because more people are going to want that, and so there'll be more of a market for it, I believe. So okay, so that was everything I wanted to talk about dairy. If you do have chronic illness, especially the different things that I mentioned, the eczema, the adult acne, the GI stuff, and pain, I think pain, oftentimes people notice when they cut out dairy, their pain levels drop. You may and probably do have antibody response or immune response to these different proteins. But if we work on our gut and we heal the lining of our gut and we keep that out of the immune system for a nice long chunk of time so that the immune response settles down, you could try adding it back in and see how you do, at least at a limited time. Okay, so that's it for today. Have a great day. If you have not gotten your little quick workout in, I encourage you to just see what you can do and just do something with body weight or some weights a little bit. 10 minutes, 15 minutes, you could do it. Okay, talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.